Good. My name's Cory Heaton. I'm a professor in the forestry department at Clemson University. And we've been doing this program around the state for, 2 years now? It's a great program. I think you're going to get a lot out of it today. I'm extremely excited to see this many people here. Jeff and I were talking about this a minute ago. This area of the state's probably had more information pushed on y'all for quail management than anywhere else in this state. The Indian Creek project's been going on for a long time, and there's been a lot of efforts from a lot of different organizations. So I'm happy to see this many people here, so I appreciate y'all being here. Just a few housekeeping things. We're going to go through a few presentations today. If you would, try to save your questions kind of towards the end so we can get through each one of them, but we want to answer your questions, so don't forget your questions. If you need restrooms, obviously they're right there. We have snacks over there, help yourself. There's drinks in the coolers back there. We'll have lunch in here later on today, and then we'll go out to the field to do a little field tour and look at some management options for you. Before I really dive into this thing and get rolling, I want to take a second and let a few folks introduce themselves. I'm going to start with Rick. Rick, if you'd like to just tell them real quick who you are and who you're with, and we'll go from there.
Rick Counts. I'm with the Clemson Deer Management Association. I got some little handouts over here, and if you don't have a magazine or you're not a member, this is a free magazine if you want one. But we're partnered with the Indian Creek project and help with the burn trailer and that kind of stuff if you haven't heard about the burn trailer.
One thing I'll point out there, Rick's with QDMA, Quality Deer Management. A lot of y'all are familiar with that. A lot of the people that we work with are managing multiple species, and a lot of the management practices we put into place are good for multiple species. So it's good to have folks like QDMA partnering with us on these things and working through it. Now, Quail Forever, would you like to just quick introduction and tell folks what you're...
I'm just here as a farmer.
Just here as a farmer. Well, today's meeting was also sponsored by Quail Forever, so I'd appreciate if y'all thank them when you get an opportunity. And with that, I'm going to dive into this thing, see where we can go with it. My talk's going to basically give you an overview of bobwhites in South Carolina and the United States for that matter. We'll talk a little bit about the natural history. I want to really focus in on habitat requirements and talk about the grassland ecosystem and its decline across the globe, not just this country, but across the globe. The Bobwhite Initiative has been a really big part of these efforts. I'm going to skip through that because Breck's got a much better talk that he gives while y'all are having lunch, and we'll let you listen to Mr. Breck on that one. One of the things I do want to point out while I'm here, though, my phone rings constantly, and I'm talking to people throughout this state, and they want me to explain to them how it's not fire ants that did away with bobwhite quail and how it's not the coyotes that did a bobwhite quail, all this damage and all these things. At the end of the day, you're going to hear this over and over and over again, probably 20 times in my talk. Bobwhite quail decline is because of habitat loss. Habitat loss, habitat loss, habitat loss. All those other factors may contribute, but if we've got habitat in place where it needs to be at, we can compensate for those things, and we can keep a healthy bobwhite population going. My father, I love him to death. He's the hard-headedest man on the face of the earth. He will argue me till he's blue in the face that his farm has not changed since he grew up on it. Well, guess what? He's wrong. It has changed. It has changed dramatically in my lifetime, and I'm half his age. So even though some of these places we think everything's the same, aren't the birds there like they used to be? There have been changes. There have been changes that didn't favor bobwhite quail. So as we go through this thing today, if you get tired of hearing about habitat, just fuss at me, because that's my thing. Bobwhite biology is pretty important. What's the first step to managing wildlife? You got to understand their biology, right? If you don't understand their biology and their adaptations, you're not going to be successful at managing those because you don't understand the habitat requirements that they need. All right, so we're going to go through this thing today, and hopefully when we're done, maybe I learned something. I usually learn more from y'all than I do anywhere else, so hopefully I learned something as well. But the bobwhite, we all know this one, the icon of the South, everybody's favorite bird. Most widely distributed upland game bird in North America. Sexually dimorphic, meaning the males and females do not resemble each other completely. You're going to see a more buff colored hen, and you're going to see that nice white streak on the face and the cheek patches in the males. They're a relatively small gallinaceous bird. What does that mean? It means they're a chicken-like bird. They are evolved to live on the ground and spend their time on the ground, very much like a chicken. Adaptations are really important when we start talking about how we're going to manage for quail. They have a beak that is curved and it is heavy. It's curved, it allows them to catch insects and feed on insects. It allows them to crush seeds if they need to crush seeds. It allows them to pick up the tiniest of seeds that are out there. That beak allows them to have a very diverse diet. And as we move through this thing, I'll point some of those things out to you. The breast on a quail. The breast on the quail, if you ever open one of these birds up, it's dark red, right? It's got a lot of fat inside that muscle designed for quick bursts of flight, but short distances of flight. That is very, very important when we start managing for these birds. Bobwhites aren't going to pick up and fly 3/4 of a mile and then pick up and fly 3/4 of a mile and pick up and fly. And they're not going to do long-range migrations. They are built to travel very short distances at fairly high rates of speed. They got a lot of vertical lift, they push up, and then they got to land, all right? The wings, if you look at the wings, they match that breast perfectly. They're a small cupped wing. And to me, I always use the bumblebee example, but if you look at the weight of a bobwhite and the size of their wings, I don't really even see how they fly. Their wings are so small. But they're not designed for long-range flight. It's a very different wing than what you would see on a mourning dove. It is a small, heavily cupped wing. All right. This is important when we start managing for them. There's a lot of studies out there. You know, you can go all the way back to Stoddard's work where he was talking about this stuff. I don't even remember the dates, but way back 50s, I guess, is when Stoddard was still writing. Bobwhites do very well if they have cover within 50 or 75 yards. If they have to pick up and fly more than 75 yards to get to escape cover, and then they get flushed again, what happens? They're dead. Their body temperatures go up too high because of all that metabolism from moving those muscles and making those things work. If they're having to pick up and fly 300 yards to escape predators, they're not going to make it. Simple as that. All right. If you have habitat where they're having to pick up and fly 75 yards and then 150 yards and then 150 yards, they're not going to make it. They're going to overheat and they're going to die. So we have to put the habitat on the ground that matches those adaptations, right? A quail's feet, if you look at them, they're a little heavier than what you'd see on some of the other birds that you're familiar with holding, but they're not like a turkey leg. They're not made to do heavy scratching. What's one of the main components we look for in good quail habitat? Bare ground, right? Exposed soil. The reason for that, they don't have the leg strength that you need to kick through a heavy duff layer to find food. We need bare ground to allow them access to get to those seeds and those insects they're looking for. Reproduction. Reproduction is really interesting when it comes to bobwhites. Pair bonds start in April. What are pair bonds? You know, you hear that male out there whistling and he calls him in this nice attractive female and they form a pair. And they go and build a nest together and she's going to lay a clutch of 12 to 14 eggs. Typically 12 is a good number there. They're going to incubate those eggs together for 23 days and then they hatch. And both the male and the female are going to work with brood rearing. Now what's interesting in bobwhites is yes, that's a pair. And that bobwhite male is going to spend a lot of time and resources in incubating and helping to raise that brood. But are those chicks his? Anybody know the answer to that? A lot of times yes, a lot of times no. See, the bobwhites do this thing to protect genetic integrity and to make sure there's a diverse gene pool. So that female will mate with that male that's her partner. She'll also mate occasionally with other males. So that bobwhite male may be raising birds that aren't his, but it's a good thing because we have genetic diversity in there and that's very important for the long-term health of the birds. You also occasionally see it where one male will mate with multiple females, but it's far more common to see a female mate with multiple males. But anyway, all that goes, we have a successful nest. 23 days later, these precocial chicks, meaning shortly after they're hatched, they're up and they're moving. They're following mom wherever they go. All right, so as soon as they hatch, these birds need what? They need brooding habitat. And they need brooding habitat very close by nesting habitat. All right, so it's very important that a chick this big has habitat close by so they can dart right in there and not be seen by predators and able to capture insects and feed. All right. What happens if we get into some of these spots where we have a tremendous amount of grass growing? It's really hard for a chick that big to make his way through grass. He needs that exposed soil. He needs those plants that come up above the ground before they start most of their biomass. So he has pathways to move around. All right, that's very important when we get into managing. And hopefully we can show you most of these things today. Parental guidance. So the male and the female bobwhite are going to spend 30 to 40 days with these chicks, guiding them through life. And at about 16 weeks of age, these birds are fully grown and they're capable of being on their own, which allows, in South Carolina, thankfully, the opportunity for that adult male and female to raise another brood. So they are capable of producing more than one brood a year, all right? That's very important because we're going to talk about mortality in a minute, and these things are like Roman candles. They're here today, gone tomorrow, all right? Life expectancy is not very long if you're a bobwhite. Very, very few bobwhites make it to a year of age. Even less make it past 1 year of age. And 2 years old is essentially a dinosaur in terms of bobwhites. They do not live long. But we just mentioned how successful they can be at reproduction and recruitment and all these things because they put so many offspring onto the ground in a good nesting year and good nesting habitat. So they are perfectly capable of overcoming this high mortality rate. All right. In the South, we see, depending on which study you look at over the years, we're going to see 70 to 95% mortality of our bobwhite population annually. If we had that with other species, we probably wouldn't talk about those species anymore. They'd be extinct by now. But the bobwhite's perfectly capable of living with that, dealing with it, compensating for it through reproduction efforts, and keeping that population going. In the South, we're going to see that mortality is higher in the spring and summer. In the North, you would see that be in the fall or winter. So we have high mortality during the spring and summer. It's very, very important because that is the brood rearing time, that's the nesting time, that we have the habitat available to help make sure some of these birds survive every year. And another thing you'll see, this is a study from Tall Timbers looking at mortality over 6 years, but the red line's the average mortality for every year, or excuse me, proportion surviving. Some years they had close to 50% survival, but a lot of years they were experiencing 90% mortality, things like that. So it is up and down, and that's got a lot to do with the climate. If we have a whole lot of rain while they're nesting, we flood nests out, things like that. If we don't have a lot of rain, we don't have enough insects, broods don't make it, so on and so forth. So the climate and the weather conditions play a big part in our bobwhite population. Hunting impact. This is one that gets me in trouble. It doesn't matter whether I'm talking with a landowner or a plantation manager. I am constantly getting this question. Should we be hunting our wild birds? Should we not be hunting our wild birds? Well, there's no way I can give you an absolute answer to that. But what I can tell you is that most biologists agree if we're doing everything that we can do and we're putting the habitat on the ground, we can tolerate modest harvest within that population. Now you're going to have to take notes and you're going to have to monitor things and you're going to have to keep track of what's happening with your birds to set your harvest level, but it can be done. There's basically two mindsets when it comes to harvesting bobwhites. There's the compensatory theory and the additive theory. So compensatory mortality is basically we can go in and harvest those bobwhites in the fall during the season or the winter during the season, however you want to look at it. We can harvest those birds because all we're actually removing is the birds that were going to naturally die anyway. So you're not impacting the total number of birds, all right? That's one mindset of looking at it. The other side of that is additive. So no, we can't go in there and hunt because the birds that we're harvesting actually add to that mortality that was already going to occur. So we're making the population go down even further. If you look in the literature at all the studies that have been done, I can find just as many examples that prove this as I can this. So what does that tell you? There isn't a right answer. It's site specific, population specific, and it changes every year because the landscape changes every year and the weather patterns change every year. So you got to base it on local, firsthand what you're doing and make your decisions based on that. I don't like textbook recommendations for harvest. I would tell you to take notes, monitor that population and adjust your harvest based on what your notes are telling you, what those records say, all right? Each site is going to have different changes to habitat. There was a logging project this year in one of the areas, all right? There was a fire that got out of control and basically sterilized part of the site that had been used for very good brood habitat. We had a very high population of raccoons this summer for some reason and all of our nests failed. that's only going to be determined on that specific site. So it's up to you as the site manager to determine whether or not you harvest or not. Aging bobwhites, this is pretty important. When we hunt bobwhites, what should the majority of our harvest be? Juvenile birds or birds of the year or adult birds? The majority of your harvest should be these juvenile birds. Why? Because bobwhites don't live long. You know, a year-old bobwhite's an old bobwhite, so there shouldn't be a whole lot of those out there. But if reproduction went well, we should have a whole lot of these birds out here. If we're not harvesting a lot of juveniles, what's one thing we need to start doing right then and there? Stop harvesting, right? Because you are out of these juvenile birds and they don't live forever, all right? How do we determine that? If you got a bobwhite wing in your hand, these feathers are called primary coverts. And on a juvenile, they're gonna have buff tips. So there'll be this tan, light brown colored tip on them. If you have that buff tip, you know you're looking at a bird of the year, all right? And if you're looking at that bird of the year, we can go a little bit further to add to your notes. Primary feathers, flight feathers are replaced in order. And we can tell you when that bird was hatched based on which feather it was replacing at that time. All right, so they're all going to replace flight feather number 5 at roughly the same age. So we can take that and backtrack and tell you when that bird was hatched. That's going to go well with your notes where you monitored the weather and kept up with what those birds are doing, and it's going to tell you what kind of impact they had on your population based on the age you're harvesting. Diet varies tremendously. You're going to see sex and age differences. You're going to see time of year differences. But laying hens and chicks have high protein demand, high calcium demands. So you're going to see a lot of insects in that diet. They feed on pretty much any bug they can grab, but it's dominated by beetles and grasshoppers and your true bugs. Beetles and grasshoppers at my place seem to make up the majority of that diet. The adult diet's really high in seeds of grasses and broadleaf weeds. But they also consume tree seeds and some plant matter. And every time I teach this class, I make sure I point out, I have yet to see a bobwhite study where they compiled the annual diet of bobwhites that didn't contain sweet gum seeds. I've never seen that. There isn't one. Bobwhites eat sweet gums. Now, why am I telling you that? Not to save sweet gum trees. I'm not telling you that to save sweet gum. It's because I'm that guy who's out in the field and I wonder, why in the world did God invent briars for me to have to walk through? What purpose do they serve? The same thing with a sweet gum tree. What purpose does it serve? Well, they actually do serve a purpose, but don't save them. You don't have to. There's going to be plenty to take care of that for you. So that's not what I'm telling you. All right. Roger Wells, I don't know if any of y'all have ever read any of his work, but Roger Wells did a really good job of compiling vegetation data, diet data from across the Southeast. A lot of different plantations, a lot of private landowners, a lot of different scientific studies were all compiled together. And when he looked at that, he documented over 1,000 different food items in bobwhite quail diets. So they have a highly diverse diet. And that's good for us. If we're focused on managing these plants and one particular plant fails that year, that's okay, because they will select a different plant and they will feed on that. So we have options out there. Diversity is very important, though. That way we have a multiple options for food items. Home range, it varies tremendously. It depends on where you're at in the country. It depends on what happened that year. And it depends mainly on the quality of habitat, but it ranges from 10 to 100 plus acres for that bird or that covey, depending on what you're looking at. I tell people this way, if I got a 100-acre tract of land that's in mediocre quality habitat, I can have a covey of birds. I can take that same 100-acre tract of land and I can make improvements and put it into exceptional habitat. I very easily can support 5 coveys of birds on that same tract of land, possibly 10 coveys of birds on that tract of land. So habitat is everything. In the South, in this state, especially 20 to 50 acres, I got most of the folks that I work with managing on 50-acre basis. What does that mean? That means on a 50-acre block, I have to provide every bit of habitat that that bird needs for the entire year. All right? Everything they need is within that 50 acres. And if you do that, they will stay within that 50 acres. What happens throughout the year with these bobwhites? We're ending summer now, so we're in October, and guess what happens in October? The fall shuffle starts happening. So all these birds of the year and the surviving adult birds are starting to break up, and then they form groups. And then they break up again and they form groups. And this may go on 3, 4, 5, 6 times where they come together and then break up and join separate groups. This goes back to protecting genetics. These birds are mixing those genetics throughout different coveys and spreading themselves out across the landscape. So the fall shuffle is what that's commonly called. Once we complete this fall shuffle, we will finally make a group that's going to stick together the remainder of the dormant season, the remainder of the winter, and that's the covey formation. So we have a covey that's going to start probably mid-October, late October, and it's going to stay together all the way through the winter. They might start busting up in March depending on where you're at in the state, but April is a great month. April's when you see these pair bonds starting to form because the coveys have broke up, the males are talking, and they're starting to call these females into them, and then you start to get these pairs instead of seeing whole coveys. All right, and that takes place. Once we get these pair bonds formed, we're going to move directly into nesting. Shortly after we start nesting, we're going to have to start raising broods. About 35 days after nesting starts, that brood's on the ground. So we're going to spend the entire summer brooding and nesting, and putting these little tiny Roman candles out there. All right, why do I call them Roman candles? Because they're here today and gone tomorrow. They were real pretty to look at for a short amount of time. All right, that's okay. They can handle that. Remember what I said earlier, habitat, habitat, habitat? One of the things that I think we overlook often, because a lot of us, myself included, we have to manage timber as a source of income as well, and quail management doesn't always exactly match timber management, all right? And I'm not telling you you can't manage timber on your land in any way, shape, or form, I do. But what we do that's strictly forestry does not benefit quail the way it does for everything else. Maybe not for anything else, other than our revenue source. Bobwhites really like a pine stand from the day we cut it down and start over till it's about 5, 6, depending on the quality of site, maybe 7, 8 years. We have good quality habitat there, all right? Then, as those trees grow and that canopy closes, we lose that vegetative structure on the ground. And when we lose that vegetative structure on the ground, we no longer have quail habitat, all right? We have pine trees. Very little quality for bobwhites, and at that point you would see your home range expand. It doesn't necessarily mean that your birds are gone, however there's a good chance for that, but they've definitely left that site to go find better habitat. We can, after a certain amount of time, when our forester tells us it's time or we make the call on our own, we can come in and open that stand up. And when we open that stand up through thinning, we start to get sunlight back to the ground, and this herbaceous component starts growing on the ground layer again, and once again we can provide quail habitat. My recommendation, if you're serious about managing quail and that's your primary focus, thin heavy, thin as early as you can get away with, and thin as often as you can get away with, right? We want a lot of sunlight reaching the ground. Now I get that that doesn't necessarily match timber management goals, all right, I get that, but we're talking two entirely different things here. There's some work now that's looking at purely pulp rotations and the benefits that they can have on bobwhites. And then we heard a study a while back, I guess that, Breck, was that at University of Georgia or Tall Timbers? Or maybe both together. So University of Georgia did a study that blew my mind where they looked at planting at densities to support bobwhites and maintaining basal areas less than, well, 50 or less. And over the grand score of the 25, 30-year rotation, there was only a couple $100 difference between managing specifically for bobwhites versus managing for maximum timber revenue. That was an eye-opener for me. I thought it would have been a lot bigger than that, but that's not what the study showed. So thin early, thin heavy, thin often. Make sure we got sunlight reaching the ground. The other thing we have to understand, not every bird or every wildlife species occupies the same niche, right? So every species has their own individual niche, right? So if we have everything on the property in the exact same age stand, we can't benefit a whole lot of species. We can only benefit the species that match that particular age forest stand. What I like to see across the landscape if we're managing for multiple species is a diversity in the age structure of the timber on that property. You know, so your bobwhites are going to heavily utilize this stage from where we've clear cut up until the successional stage where trees start to dominate the system. After that, it's not bobwhite habitat anymore. You start picking up other species like the white-eyed vireo. And then as this stand becomes a more and more mature forest, by the time we reach maturity, we're doing great things for the wild turkey, not necessarily anything good for the bobwhite at that point. The way we compensate for that is by harvesting in different time frames and replanting in different time frames, so we're diversifying the age class of timber on that property. This is a study that I did in Beaufort County years ago where we radio collared birds and we put them in, you know, these were wild birds. We captured them, we put radio collars on them, we turned them right back loose where we caught them. The entire plantation, well, that side of the plantation was managed specifically for bobwhites, and there was good bobwhite habitat all over it, all right? What we wanted to see was what particular components of that habitat was the most important to those birds, which ones they were utilizing the most. So what you'll see, occurrences are the number of times I recorded those birds in that particular habitat. And this gives you the percentages of total occurrences. So out of every occurrence that I recorded, how many times, or what percentage of it was recorded in mature pines. And then we put in what percentage of the study area that particular habitat occupied. If I know what percent of that study area it occupied and my total number of occurrences, if the use was evenly distributed, the expected number of occurrences would be this right here. So, for example, mature pines, we recorded 500, and by mature pines, I'm talking basal areas of 60 or less. A lot of it was in basal areas of 40 or less. Essentially, the starting of pine savanna, you know, basically scattered trees with a lot of grass and forbs, all right? But we had 591 occurrences in those mature pine stands, but that was 41.8% of the study area, all right? The expected number that we should have saw was 398. So they actually used those areas more than they should have. But the ones that really stand out to me, and we saw a spectacular example of this not long ago, wooded ditch lines. Wooded ditch lines, we saw 89 occurrences. Based on the available habitat on that property, we should have only saw 8. So what does that tell us? It tells us that wooded ditch lines are extremely, extremely important to bobwhites. Not long ago, TJ and I did a field day in the middle of Mr. Williamson's property, and Mr. Williamson is an avid quail manager in the PD region of the state. And it was nothing but without doubt, the best quail habitat I've looked at in the state of South Carolina. He has got everything right, and he's got it where it needs to be at. We pull up with a group just like y'all, and we're standing there looking at all this beautiful habitat, and we're listening to 5 or 6 males whistle, and they're all in a straight line. Anybody want to take a guess as to why? Because right in the middle of all this wonderful habitat is a wooded ditch line, and every male in that property was on that ditch line. It's extremely, extremely important. Why do I take my time to tell you that? Because I visit properties all the time, and they come through and herbicide the ditch lines or mow the ditch lines out. Those wooded ditch lines are critical to bobwhites. They're using them a lot. Lespedeza patches. Lespedeza obviously is not a highly recommended thing anymore, but we can say shrub patches and it'll do the same thing, right? They use those extensively. So we had 43 occurrences, we should have only saw 4. Those shrub lines are extremely important to bobwhites. And in this case, the Lespedeza patches, whether we were using shrubs or just regular Lespedeza, they were used to divide fields that were being managed for bobwhites. So we were breaking up those fields, we were providing travel corridors, we were providing opportunities for nesting, feeding, brood rearing, all these things. Very important. Food plots were utilized extensively in this. Now you don't see that a lot in the literature. These food plots were not your standard white-tailed deer food plots. These were food plots for bobwhites. It was standing sorghum with things growing in them. You had nice open ground layer where those birds could mingle through there unobstructed. You had seed, you had insects, you had those things. So those were important. Field borders. Field borders didn't show up as important as they should have in this study. We only had 54 occurrences, but you should have saw 136. The reason behind that, the fields with these borders were not being managed for row crops with a field border on the edge of it. The entire field was being managed for bobwhite habitat, so there wasn't a lot of difference between the border and the field itself, right? So what that was showing me is that edge is very important for bobwhites, but if we've got good quality habitat, we can extend the portions of that field that they're actually using. All right. We didn't see a whole lot of difference in when we burned. We had a lot of different burn plots and disc treatments in this study. We didn't see a whole lot of difference in habitat use there. And interestingly, TJ already pointed this out for the field tour that I'm that guy that tells you to cut every tree down in your food plots. I don't want trees around my open areas. Why is that? In this study, I had 13 birds collared and 6 of them wound up in the same hawk nest. Because there was a nice perch tree looking down on that field, and every time they come off that ditch line, he was picking them off. We have to think about these things when we manage. The natural history, bobwhites are not new to the New World. They've been here in fossil records for over 2.5 million years, so they've been around a long time. Now, over that 2.5 million years, I'm sure that population has risen and fallen based on what has happened with habitat over that duration. Multiple quail species in the U.S. The one we're focused on today, obviously, is the northern bobwhite. If you're one of these people who likes to split everything up and call them different subspecies, I'm not one, but you know, if that's your thing, go ahead. If you follow that, there are 22 subspecies of bobwhite quail in North America, Mexico, and very northern Central America. We have the subspecies Virginianus, all right? Atlantic coast, you're gonna see them from Florida to Virginia, and then you'll see them all the way into Alabama, and then we start switching into a different subspecies as we move west of Alabama. So the bobwhite historical range was 38 states, the Gulf side of Mexico predominantly, and just the very start of Central America. They have been introduced throughout this country and lots of other countries at this point. But historically, we think of them as a southern bird. Very good populations along the Atlantic coast. Historically, not necessarily anymore. Well, what happened with them? What's going on with them across the U.S. in that native range? So we go back and look at the breeding bird survey. And in 1980, the breeding bird survey indicated that our U.S. population was a little over 19 million birds. All right. Scroll forward to 1999, we're down to 6 million birds nationwide. That's a huge loss in a short amount of time. A huge loss in a short amount of time. So that was a decline of 65% across its range. Annual rate of decline 3.8%. That was from 82 to 99. So we have seen tremendous losses across the native range over the past 30, 40 years now. Well, 50, 60 years now. And if you look at the harvest, a lot of the Department of Natural Resources throughout this range monitor harvest and keep records of these things. And it was down 2/3 range wide. Mississippi harvest went down 92%, South Carolina went down 90%, Louisiana 90%. Why did the harvest go down more than the population went down?
Hunter participation.
Hunter participation. I remember very well my grandfather was a bird dog man and he loved to hunt bobwhites. The last day, I remember it very well. My grandmother came, picked me up from school that afternoon. I go back to the house. My grandfather had come in from hunting and he didn't put the dogs back in the kennel. And I was like, what's wrong, Papa? He didn't put the dogs up. And he was out on the front porch and I went and asked him. He's like, no point. There's no birds left. I'm never going again. They're the yard dogs now. And those dogs walked that yard till the day they died. A lot of hunters got frustrated. You know, they'd grown up going and getting on 6, 7, 8 coveys in a short amount of time and enjoying themselves. And then, you know, the late 80s, they were struggling to get a bird up. So the hunters just fell off. They fell off. That can have some devastating impacts for all of us. Why? Because if young people aren't exposed to bobwhite hunting, they're not going to care about bobwhites, and we got a species that somebody really needs to care about right now. But it's not just the bobwhite that we're seeing these problems with. You remember I mentioned earlier that every species has their own individual niche, and this is true. But a lot of these species have overlapping niches or similar habitat requirements. And those species that have similar habitat requirements are experiencing these same losses to population across this range, just like we're seeing with the bobwhites. A lot of species. So I pulled together some stuff from different studies across the country just to kind of highlight what I'm talking about here. But if you look at this graph, and this is something that was pulled together by Mississippi State, but the green line is the northern bobwhite, and this shows you the population trend from 1966 to 2008. And you notice that's a pretty steady decline. The eastern meadowlark, which has very similar habitat requirements, you see an almost identical loss in population over that amount of time. Other species that may or may not have been as common or may have a little more diversified habitat, you still saw a steady decline in those populations like we saw with the grasshopper sparrow and the field sparrow. This is happening across the country. Multiple studies are documenting this. This is from the Fish and Wildlife Service Region 4. So they compared northern bobwhite and the loggerhead shrike. Those populations almost match each other in their decline. In South Carolina, what did we see from 96 to 2010? We saw, from 60 down to 10, or from 60 down to almost 0, we had a tremendous loss in our bobwhite population. Well, what's happened across the landscape? This is a big one for me. I'm a farmer, grew up on farms, argue with my dad to this day that nothing's changed on his farm. Wonderful things, but there has been changes. If we go back to 1920, there were 200,000 registered farms in South Carolina. If you scroll forward to 2012, there were 24,000 registered farms. We lost 180,000 farms over this time frame. That's significant. We didn't lose all that agricultural land because what we saw was the average farm size dramatically increased. We went from an average farm size of about 65, 70 acres up to around 220, 230 acres. So the farms got significantly bigger, but we also lost a lot of the acreage to other uses. We developed the properties for commercial activities. We developed it into residential areas. Not all that farmland was saved and put into different farms. So there were some major changes that went on. Also, the way that a farmer managed a 50-acre farm in 1920 compared to the way that a farmer manages a 250 to 10,000 acre farm in 2019 is very much different. How many farmers in 1920 had boom sprayers and went across and cleaned up their fields with herbicides? They didn't have that. How many farmers that are farming today have boom sprayers that they go across the field and spray herbicides? Every one of them. I'm not telling you that herbicides killed the quail. I'm telling you that herbicides killed the plant that the quail needs to survive. All right? And I'm not telling you that I'm knocking farmers, because I am one and we need herbicides to make it, but there are better ways for us to manage. What happened in other places? Because these places experienced the same trends in agriculture that we experienced. In Louisiana, population plummeted. In New Jersey, population plummeted. In Delaware, population plummeted. All during the same time period as we become more modernized and we changed land uses and how we manage the land. You can see the same things happening with the eastern meadowlark. This is all from Ohio. I was trying to mix this up and show you that it's not just us that's having this problem. It's range wide. Grasshopper sparrow, tremendous decline. Field sparrows, same thing. Bobolinks. Every state that manages for bobwhites has experienced this. Some have experienced it more than others. We had a state, was it last year, Breck, that Pennsylvania declared the bobwhite extinct? So the state of Pennsylvania now no longer has wild bobwhite quail. All right, that can happen anywhere, but folks like y'all are making sure we don't have that issue happen here, and that's a very good thing. This one's kind of interesting. So there was a study done at Rolling Plains Quail Research Ranch where they looked at turkey and bobwhite populations over the same time period in Texas and Missouri. All right, and what they found is that the bobwhite population was crashing in Texas. During that same amount of time, the turkey population was dramatically improving. All right, they saw the same thing in Missouri. Why is that? Turkeys favor mature hardwood forest and big open areas. Bobwhites like that nasty, overgrown, early successional habitat. So as these forests got older, they no longer provided quail habitat, but they became excellent turkey habitat. So you saw that happen. All right. This has happened in a lot of different places. This one, I like to use this one all the time. Rick, can you earplug it for a second? So the reason we don't have quail anymore is because the deer ate all of them. I'm just kidding. Deer didn't eat the quail. They just ate everything that the quail needed. What we saw in this state is while that bobwhite population was plummeting, our white-tailed deer population was dramatically improving and getting bigger and bigger. And today I think it's a little better off for the multiple species management approach where we can look at having white-tailed deer populations in good health on the same property that we can have bobwhite quail populations on. Do y'all remember back in the 90s what happened with deer in this state? The highest our population's ever been. We were well over 1 million animals in this state. Anybody in here ever grazed cattle in woods? You ever had cattle in the woods? You can look through the woods and there ain't nothing but tree stalks. That's what happened with our deer herd in this state. When we were over 1 million animals, we could not support that population, and they wiped out every bit of vegetation they could wipe out. It was gone. It was eliminated. I saw it. I know I'm not the only one in here that saw it. It happened. All right? When we were 1 million plus animals, we decimated bobwhite habitat. Now, I don't know that there's a study that specifically says that, but there is some correlation there. But at the same time, too, we can't point strictly at the deer at that. What also happened in the 70s? We really got amped up into forest management, right? McCormick County went from cotton fields and soybeans to nothing but pine trees. Y'all remember seeing that? They were all planted at the exact same time. They're all the exact same age. What happens to your habitat when you do that? It's a very short window that is quail habitat, and then it becomes habitat for other species. You have eliminated the value of that habitat. For bobwhites, the population suffers. But if anybody asks, the deer ate all the quail. Grassland decline. You know, I mentioned this earlier. This is not just an issue in the South. It's not just an issue in the U.S. This is a global issue, and it's happening all over the place. Lots of studies out here documenting this at this point, but grasslands are becoming one of the most imperiled ecosystems on the planet. Why? If you have to go farm, and we have to go farm because we're feeding the entire world at this point relies on a handful of farmers to feed them. And in order to do that, we have to bring new land into agriculture because so much land is being lost to other uses. It just depends on which country you're in and what part of the world you're in. But it's much easier to convert a grassland into agriculture production than it is to convert a forest into agriculture production. So we're losing grasslands at a very high rate. Looking at some of the studies that are out there, food production demands expected to increase 75% over the next 30 years. Well, you're going to have to find places to grow to account for that huge increase. So grasslands are taking a big hit and are going to continue to take a big hit. I usually don't read these things, but I always do this one in this class. But there was a study done a while back that really caught my attention, and it was talking about the decline of grassland systems and the implications of us not stepping in and doing something here. But the loss and fragmentation of grasslands is causing the extinction of uncounted populations and species, like we've seen in Pennsylvania, changes in the structure and function of ecosystems, depletions of environmental services, and the decline in human well-being. Grasslands play huge roles in how this world operates, and they're very important habitat for a lot of different species. So by losing all these areas, we're going to run into some problems with that. We're already running into it. And I show this one to my dad all the time. No, we don't do anything different today than we did in 1962 when I started farming, boy. Yeah, right. Yeah, right. We clean till, we strip till, we do conservation stuff where we're not tilling at all anymore. But in every one of those systems, we do everything within our abilities to limit weed growth. And we need weeds to support bobwhites, right? Clean farming is important. We got a lot of people to feed. I'm not bashing the farmer. He has got to feed all of us and everybody else. It's got to happen. But in the process of doing that, we have really eliminated this habitat. If you'd have looked at this field in 1920, what would it look like? This field would have been owned by 5 different men, and it would have been divided with fence lines that had grown up in weeds and provided perfect travel areas for those bobwhites to travel across this field and use sections of this field safely. Now, that bobwhite's not going to pick up and fly 300 yards to the middle to dive in there and start feeding. He's going to have to work his way around the edges. He's limited to that. He's not going to get what he needs out of this agriculture setting anymore. We have, you'll hear about a lot of these opportunities today, but field borders are extremely important. Breaking these fields up into smaller sections using hedgerows, very, very important. But big scale farming is not a great friend of the bobwhite quail. Turkeys don't mind it. Bobwhites, that doesn't match their habitat requirements. I'm skipping all this because Breck does a much better job with it. So I'm going to close with this one. The main thing I wanted y'all to get today from my talk is that habitat's extremely important. Yes, fire ants kill quail. Yes, raccoons destroy nests. Yes, possums destroy nests. Now that I have armadillos probably cause some nest failures. But if we have the habitat in place, we can compensate for most of those things. Thank Thank y'all. Anybody got any questions?
When you said that Pennsylvania had declared an extinct, it surprised me. Have there been any studies done on the Amish way of farming? Are the quails surviving that?
You know, I don't know the answer to that, Jamie. I don't know. I haven't read of any of them, but that doesn't mean they hadn't happened. That's interesting.
I think that their habitat will stay kind of the way it has been, and that there are some surviving quail populations on their farm.
Yeah. And I have traveled through Amish country, and it is similar to what I expect you would have seen before my time. So I don't know the answer to that. And it may be that the isolation itself, because the Amish farms are surrounded by modern farms, so that would be an isolated habitat. And over time, it didn't replenish itself, and that happens. Yes, ma'am.
It would also seem that not just, the size of the farms changing, going from the 50-acre farms to the mega farms, would be the monoculture in it. When it was in the 1900s, a 50-acre farm, they were growing stuff to support their family and have a diversity. But now, we'll get the giant potato farms or something. And so then you're not getting the diversity of the insects and things going in there.
So many components changed in agriculture over the time. So, I mean, every aspect of agriculture has changed over this time frame. Every aspect. Modern farming has to be extremely efficient at producing crops, or people can't afford to farm. This year's a perfect example. I guarantee you at the end of this year, half the farms in South Carolina are going under. They're going to flop this year. It's going to be just like what was seen in the 80s. The prices are horrible. The growing conditions have not been favorable. It's bad. You're going to see a lot of that this year. And those farmers who are able to pull through are only able to pull through because they're capitalizing and getting the absolute best they can get off of that piece of land to stay in operation. So this is a tough subject, and I don't know what the right answer is going to be. I don't know. We have to feed people. We have to feed people. And we don't have a whole lot of new folks moving into the field of agriculture. Not in this country anyway. So, I don't know what the right answer is on this or how to address that problem other than working with farmers to find ways for us to benefit wildlife and make it optional for them to make a good living as well. And I think you're going to find most of that is available through cost share programs where tax dollars are used to compensate the farmer for taking pieces of land out of agricultural production and putting them into wildlife habitat. And we have a lot of farmers who are doing these processes now. A lot of them, it's very common. We're seeing it in more and more places. So hopefully those things hold up. Hopefully the farm bills continue to fund these things. If not, we're going to be in a world of trouble faster than we're already getting there.
I hope precision ag is going to help in both aspects.
Yeah.
Help the farmer and help the wildlife.
Yeah, and precision ag can. Precision ag is going to allow us to use technologies that reduce our inputs. It's going to make us more efficient. We're already seeing that. But still, at the end of the day, if I'm a farmer, I have got to maximize my yield and the quality of my yield, or I'm not in business. I tell people all the time, one of my good friends is a big dairy farmer. In order to go harvest silage 6 weeks out of the year, he's got $1 million machine that sits there, and 6 weeks out of the year it operates. You got to make the crop to pay for the equipment today. That's just the nature of the game. Yes, sir.
Are there specific things you can put in the food plot that would be better for instance, the bobwhite quail as opposed to deer?
Well, I haven't found anything we can plant that's opposed to deer. I want to talk about clover at our field trip, but there's things we can change about the way we manage. Clover's a good example. So we plant clover for deer and turkeys, all right? And how do we manage it? We come in and mow it a couple times during the growing season, right? And then we'll spray that clover to kill the grass out of it so that we just have a pure stand of clover. Craig Harper has done a lot of work in Tennessee showcasing different ways to manage clover where we're mowing once a year and we're allowing those weeds to come up in that stand. And surprisingly, we're still producing very similar volumes and quality of clover underneath that canopy of weeds that's providing quail habitat. So there are some changes we can do to how we're managing our current crops. But you know, if you're just planting something for bobwhites, I used to tell folks sorghum's a good option until the sugarcane aphid showed up, and now it's dang near impossible to grow sorghum anymore, or any of the plants related to sorghum. But more of the grass type plants. The main thing is allowing the weedy components to be in that food plot. You know, today, I don't know where the mindset came from, but the mindset today with most folks who plant food plots is they want not necessarily a monoculture, but they want a pure stand of what they planted. They want to keep all the weeds out of it, and they want the crops they planted in there. That doesn't really benefit bobwhites. We need diversity of plants out there on that landscape.
That doesn't benefit anything.
I don't disagree.
It makes that food plot available 2 weeks out of the year.
I agree. I agree.
Why
Yes, sir.
has less of these have fallen out of favor because it's non-native?
Well, bicolor can be a very invasive plant. It can be a very invasive plant. And
But it does good habitat.
it does provide great habitat. You know, not just for bobwhites. You know, I got a lot of studies where we were looking at painted buntings and bluegrass beaks and indigo buntings, and they extensively use it as nest
But
sites.
it's fallen out of favor.
When you keep it in check and keep it where you want it, it's not horrible. When you fail to do that and it starts moving and out competing some of the other stuff, then it's a problem. Ask TJ, he'll give you a much better answer because he doesn't like it. You know, he can tell you this is what it does. And he's right. In the things he says, he's right. That's what it does. But the other thing, you're also back to, if with bicolor, for example, you're planting bicolor as a food resource. Bicolor is consumed by bobwhites, but it is by nowhere near their favorite food item. What it is a good option when your native plants have failed. You have an available food source in the winter. But bicolor fails as well, you know, so I'm not 100% opposed to it, as long as you keep it in check and where it needs to be. You know, weeds out of place. If it's where I placed it, I don't call it a weed.
And depending on your soil type, it can be either not too invasive, or it can be really bad.
Yeah, I've been to sites where it has dominated everything in the understory. I've seen that. But then I've seen places where we haven't used it as like hedgerows to break up fields, and because of the cultivation practices that are going on in the fields, it hasn't got out of check, and it's providing a valuable wildlife service. It has good and bad. It has good and bad. All right, well, I'm going to switch gears and turn it over to somebody that probably knows a lot more about this than I do. Thank y'all.